Number 12. Stolen PlayStation leads to stabbing. When Jake Bellotta's PlayStation disappeared in 2018, he suspected his former roommate, Joshua Barnes, of stealing the console. Barnes had recently been evicted for non-payment of rent and had left the front door to the apartment in Maitland, Florida, unlocked when he moved out. Bellotta was angry about it, and he also suspected Barnes of breaking back into the unit and taking the PlayStation, along with a bong and a weed scale. A third roommate, Ian McClurg, would later tell authorities that Bellotta was beyond pissed about the alleged theft. In fact, he was so mad he supposedly punched a hole in the wall. But Bellotta's anger didn't end there. Adding to his outrage was the fact that Barnes was reportedly bragging to others about stealing the PlayStation, and because Bellotta was now worried that others would break into the apartment. According to McClurg, he was also intent on getting his missing property back and devised a plan to lure Barnes to the residence. Bellotta allegedly invited his former roommate to a made-up event and promised that there would be women there. When Barnes arrived at the apartment, Bellotta stabbed him 17 times while McClurg watched. Before Bellotta and McClurg could wrap the victim's body up in garbage bags like they planned, their new roommate arrived home and dialed 911 as soon as he saw the carnage inside. In a chilling recording of the call, the unnamed roommate told the dispatcher that there had been a homicide at his home and that he knew there were ongoing problems between the suspects and the victim, but that he didn't know exactly what happened because he had just arrived home. When the dispatcher asked him how he knew Barnes was dead, he said that the victim was laying on top of a plastic bag and not moving. The terrified caller also expressed his fear that the perpetrators would do something to hurt him and his girlfriend. Officers found McClurg in the bathroom and they apprehended Bellotta in a shopping plaza parking lot. Bellotta told the responding cops that Barnes was the aggressor and that he killed the victim in self-defense. But his story didn't hold up in court. He was convicted of murder and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. McClurg pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and tampering with evidence and was sentenced to 10 years behind bars. Number 11. Drunk driver destroys his own family. Just weeks into the 2023 new year, a speeding car struck a barrier along a Staten Island highway during the early morning hours. The vehicle then slammed into a utility pole and a brick wall with such force that it broke into 3 pieces. It was so mangled it was barely recognizable. The driver, 30-year-old Adam Nikizic, was seriously injured. His pregnant 23-year-old fiancée, Adriana Silmatage, was also injured and launched from the passenger seat. She and the couple's unborn baby lost their lives. A responding officer had to cut Nikizic out from his seatbelt. He allegedly told the cop that another vehicle cut him off, but according to a police report, he was unsteady on his feet, his speech was slurred, and he reeked of booze. Nikizic was unaware of the deaths of Silmatage and the baby when he was wheeled into a courtroom a few days later in a hospital gown. He learned the horrific news that day when he was arraigned on manslaughter, criminally negligent homicide, vehicular assault, and drunk driving charges. When he realized the extent of the tragedy, Nikizic broke down in tears, but his problems were just beginning. In late February, about a month after the wreck, a grand jury indicted him on a slew of upgraded charges, including depraved indifference murder and aggravated vehicular homicide. According to the indictment, Nikizic had a blood alcohol level of more than 0.18 on the day of the accident, more than twice the legal limit for driving in the state. It's rare for a murder charge to result from a drunk driving fatality, according to the New York Daily News, but prosecutors sometimes resort to the charge in cases where the driver was so reckless that they showed a complete disregard for human life. If convicted, Nikizic could face 15 years to life in prison. Number 10. Homebuyer resorts to arson to avoid purchasing house. John Pfeiffer Jr. had already committed to buying a $400,000 house in Newtown Township, Pennsylvania in 2014 when he realized that he couldn't afford it. In fact, he was more than aware of the fact that he lacked the resources to purchase the home. And instead of owning up to it, he entered the final negotiating stages with the owners and realtor, claiming that he planned to pay cash for the property. During the last night in their home before they planned to hand the keys over to Pfeiffer, the owners overheard what sounded like someone trying to break in. They called the police, who found Pfeiffer nearby in his vehicle. He claimed he was just driving around to familiarize himself with the area and agreed to go down to the police station for questioning. Officers performed a routine search of Pfeiffer and found a lighter, latex gloves, and other implements indicating that he was planning to commit an arson. In his vehicle, they found lighter fluid, hickory chips, and more latex gloves. He allegedly said the items were for a planned cookout, but his wife told the police that there was no planned cookout. Investigators concluded that Pfeiffer initially planned to pay for the house with a fraudulent cashier's check. Instead, he settled on burning it down to avoid following through with a deal that he knew he couldn't honor. His wife was just as unaware of this as she was about the alleged cookout. She told officers that just weeks earlier, Pfeiffer moved a family out of their home, claiming it was mold-infested, only to discover that they had been evicted for not paying rent. Pfeiffer told his wife that his parents had loaned him the money to buy the new house with. He was charged with burglary and other felony offenses in connection with the incident. Number 9. Former cop turns to burglary. Janelle Garrick was working as a sheriff's deputy in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, when she was busted for burglarizing people's homes while they were at their loved ones' funerals in 2018. According to authorities, she planned the crimes ahead of time by reading the obituaries, researching the deceased relatives, and figuring out where they lived. Knowing they would most likely be saying their final goodbyes at the person's service, she made her move. She was reportedly captured committing at least one home break-in on doorbell camera footage. Garrick was fired from her job and arrested the following year, but she apparently didn't learn her lesson. While she was out on bond for her pending charges, she was allegedly caught burglarizing yet another home about 60 miles, 96 kilometers west of Milwaukee. In this particular case, she was accused of stealing narcotic painkillers. Detectives connected Garrick to at least 6 burglaries through fingerprints on evidence left behind at the scenes. The prosecutor asked the judge for a 1-year prison sentence, but in a rare move, he imposed a harsher 2-year sentence followed by 3 years of probation. Garrick blamed her actions on her opioid addiction and agreed that she deserved punishment, but said that she felt she needed more help than was being offered. As they say though, do the crime, do the time. Number 8. Bride almost drowns on her wedding day. For reasons that aren't fully known, a bride jumped off a boat and into some water on her wedding day in 2017 and nearly drowned under the weight of her gown. Her photographer was there to capture the moment on camera, but instead of the memorable snapshot she was likely hoping for, she got stuck under the heavy, multi-layered dress. 5 bystanders jumped in to rescue her, but the trapped bride spent nearly half a minute enveloped by her attire before she was freed. It's unclear where the botched photo op occurred, but the Daily Mail speculated that it happened somewhere in the United States. Sadly, what seemed like a beautiful moment quickly turned into a nightmare, but luckily the newlywed emerged from the ordeal alive. Number 7. Botched break-in. A homeowner in Lake Seminole, Florida, awoke early in the morning one day in 2022 to someone trying to break into their house. They discovered a woman unlocking the front door after smashing through its window with a hammer, causing an estimated $400 in damages. Prepared to do whatever it took to protect themselves and their residence, the homeowner confronted the intruder with a gun and told her to leave. Jackson County deputies responded to the residence after receiving a call about a suspicious female, possibly under the influence of drugs, walking around the area. They identified the suspect as a 35-year-old New Mexico woman named Amber Montoya, who reportedly has a lengthy criminal history spanning 5 states. She was charged with burglary and criminal mischief. Jackson County Sheriff Donald Edenfield used the incident as an opportunity to remind the public that this type of behavior won't be tolerated and encouraged residents to defend themselves and their property by any means necessary. Number 6. Cat burglars get captured. A homeowner arrived at her residence in Indian River County, Florida one day in 2019 and was immediately put off when her pet cat didn't rush over to greet her like usual. She then noticed that her $1,200 flat-screen TV was missing and called 911 to report the burglary. Footage from a neighbor's surveillance camera showed the intruders entering the woman's home and leaving with the cat and the TV. The suspects were later identified as 32-year-old Martavis Owens and 32-year-old Nicole Marie White of Vero Beach. A deputy visited White and asked about the stolen property, and she admitted that she and Owens had sold a TV at a pawn shop. She still had the cat and a jewelry box that she stole from the victim, and she gave both to the deputy after admitting that the theft was a dumb idea. Authorities charged White and Owens with dealing in stolen property, giving false information to a pawnbroker, grand theft, and burglary. The arrests came just a year after the pair were nabbed during a traffic stop, along with a third suspect for drug and gun charges. Hopefully, since then, they've squared away their legal issues and have stayed out of trouble. Number 5. Reality TV stars rescued from deadly heat. One sweltering hot summer day in 2022, 8 women went to Camelback Mountain in Phoenix, Arizona to film themselves on a hike for a religious reality show called Bad Girls Gone God. Temperatures soared to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 37.8 degrees Celsius, and it wasn't long before the group became wildly uncomfortable. To say they were unprepared for the strenuous nature walk on Echo Canyon Trail would be an understatement. Cast member Kristen Livingston later told local station KPHO that the group was unaware that the planned walk was along one of Phoenix's most challenging trails. It's true, there's even a Facebook group called Please Don't Die or Have to Be Rescued on Camelback Mountain, Arizona, which is designed to warn people of the dangers associated with the trail. The ladies began the hike at around 7 o'clock in the morning, with each participant carrying just a single bottle of water for the day. By noon, they had broken up into several groups, with some forging on ahead, while others lagged behind. At that point, the women realized they were in danger due to the excruciating heat and their lack of preparedness. Thanks to their decision to promptly call for help, they all survived. Some of the participants were wheeled down the mountain, while others were lifted to safety via helicopter, and 3 of the rescued individuals were hospitalized in stable condition. Number 4. Mom quits parenting. Deputies from the Anderson County Sheriff's Office in South Carolina received an alarming call in June of 2022 when a boater spotted 3 unsupervised teenage siblings on Cemetery Island, locally known as Ghost Island. The kids reportedly said that they camped on the island the night before with their mother, Courtney Taylor, and her boyfriend, Eric Elrod. They told authorities that the adults said they were going to get water earlier that day, but never returned. Their vehicle was gone from its parking spot on the mainland. The sheriff's office initially considered Taylor a missing person and posted her photo online, along with an appeal to the public for information regarding her possible whereabouts. Elrod was also considered missing at first. Deputies eventually located the missing couple's vehicle. At some point, they determined that even though Taylor was nowhere to be found, she most likely wasn't in danger. They soon learned that she had allegedly been in contact with her ex-husband, who had taken the children into his car, and that she was seen in the area. Deputies picked Taylor up and charged her with 3 counts of child neglect. At the time the story broke, Elrod was still on the run and was wanted on suspicion of distributing methamphetamine. Number 3. Shoplifting with a cop. Every holiday season, it seems as though at least one person in the United States makes news headlines for being arrested for theft during a Shop with a Cop event, which are designed to bring law enforcement and local communities closer together. In late 2022, that honor went to a man named Brad, who was busted for allegedly stealing from a Walmart store in St. Cloud, Florida. According to the Osceola County Sheriff's Office, there were around 40 deputies present at the event, as well as a forensic team, a community service team, and Sheriff Marcos Lopez himself. In a Facebook post featuring a photo of the suspect, the agency described the alleged crime as a bad idea, and further wrote, "Seriously, we just can't make this up." Around the same time, another pair of suspects, Robert Crabtree and Amber Boyd, were nabbed at a similar event at a Meijer store in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Around 50 members of the Clark County Sheriff's Department and other law enforcement agencies were present when they had to stop what they were doing to arrest Crabtree, who was allegedly caught stealing in the middle of the act. Boyd was arrested about 45 minutes later as officers were checking out at the registers with their shoppers. Another noteworthy Shop with a Cop arrest came in 2018 during an event at a Target store in Bloomfield Township, Michigan. Some of the 15 cops who were in attendance noticed 2 women allegedly attempting to leave the store with a shopping cart containing around $1,900 worth of electronics that weren't paid for. Officers caught up with the pair, later identified as 18-year-old Dana Johnson and 40-year-old Kiana Wilson, and took them into custody on suspicion of felony retail fraud. Unfortunately, these examples weren't the first, and they certainly won't be the last of people trying to get away with blatant theft during Shop with a Cop events. Number 2. Hiking across the Bering Strait. In early 2006, a British national named Carl Bushby and an American citizen named Dmitry Kiefer set out to cross a frozen portion of the Bering Strait. This is a body of water that separates Alaska from Russia's Far East. Aside from the obvious dangers of the arduous trek across the 56-mile, 90-kilometer stretch of ice, the pair apparently failed to consider the issues they might have with Russian immigration authorities if they actually reached their destination. The hike was successful, and as one might predict, Bushby and Kiefer encountered problems after reaching Siberia. According to border security spokesperson Andrei Orlov, 2 men were arrested in Chukotka province for failing to register with the authorities, something they were required to do within 3 days of arriving, even if they had visas. While Orlov declined to specifically name the individuals who were arrested, it was pretty clear, based on the circumstances, that the men in question were Kiefer and Bushby. The timing also aligned with a blog entry on Bushby's website, which described how the pair reached Russia after 15 days of hiking. According to the site, Bushby crossed the Bering Strait as part of a round-the-world hike that he started 8 years earlier in 1998. His father, Keith Bushby, confirmed to the press that Bushby and Kiefer were detained shortly after their arrival in Russian territory. Bushby's last blog entry before he and Kiefer were nabbed by authorities stated that the two were in the village of Uelen, which is located near the point where the Chukchi Sea and the Bering Sea meet. He wrote that they were on their way to a city further down the coast to register with authorities. But the authorities evidently found them first, and because they did not enter the country at an official border crossing, their passports weren't stamped. Keith Bushby told the Associated Press that the incident didn't come as a total surprise to the travelers. In fact, they expected it, since they knew they would be entering a country at a very remote point with no designated entry point. But he said that if Russian officials denied the men permission to continue, it would unfortunately cut his son's journey short, which he hoped wouldn't happen. Luckily, a Russian appeals court ultimately gave them permission to continue after the British Prime Ministers and the governor of Chukotka got involved. Number 1. Government blamed for preventable disaster. In early March of 2023, parts of California were hammered by heavy rains that led to catastrophic flooding, leaving entire neighborhoods submerged and countless civilians stranded. Along the Pajaro River in Monterey County, a levee broke from the force of the overflowing water and inundated the farming town of Pajaro. Shortly after the disaster, rumors began to swirl about how authorities had long known of the levee's potential to break. They allegedly chose not to take any action to fix it because Pajaro was simply too poor for the government to care. In the words of the Los Angeles Times, officials didn't think it made financial sense to prioritize levee repairs to protect the low-income area. So what did they do? Absolutely nothing. Stu Townsley of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers told the Times that it was known by the early 1960s that the levees were probably not adequate for the water that the system gets. And experts revisited the matter several times over the years, but things never turned out favorably for Pajaro's residents in terms of benefit-cost ratios. According to an Army Corps web page dated to 2021, the outdated levee system was built in 1949. Since then, severe flooding has hit Pajaro on at least 5 occasions, including in 1995, when floodwaters breached the levees and caused 2 drowning deaths, along with an estimated $50 to $95 million in damages. Still, nothing was done to make the town safer. Pajaro was flooded again in 1997 and 1998, at which point then-President Bill Clinton issued a disaster declaration. Yet again, nothing was done. In January 2023, just a few months before the most recent flooding event, Pajaro's residents were evacuated for an entire week due to the risk of flooding. This, unfortunately, isn't surprising. As Monterey County Supervisor Luis Alejo pointed out, low-income neighborhoods and communities have always historically been ignored by state and federal governments. Sadly, it took repeated catastrophes for leaders to finally decide that it's a good idea to build a new levee system that can withstand the forces of nature.
Luke Caroll and Anthony Prince. Australian best friends Luke Caroll and Anthony Prince forever branded themselves the Dumb and Dumber bank robbers in 2005 when they committed a heist in Vail, Colorado. But the robbery was fraught with mistakes that even the newest of thieves wouldn't make. The pair forgot to remove their work name tags and took no effort to disguise their Australian accents as they brandished BB guns. They then demanded cash from the teller, who recognized them as customers based on their accents. But despite these mistakes, the duo made off with around $130,000 in cash. It took police less than a day to identify the suspects, who they'd recently spoken with in connection with a credit card fraud investigation. By then, Caroll and Prince had already bought a Rolex, given a $20,000 tip to a taxi driver, and used the money in other ways that further pointed toward their guilt. Authorities arrested the men at Denver International Airport, where they were attempting to board a flight to Mexico. And just minutes earlier, the men had posted photos of themselves holding the ill-gotten cash from the robbery on social media. They'd also tried mailing a portion of the money to Australia, and some of it was found in airport garbage cans. Caroll and Prince may not have been aware of what lay in store for them with the American justice system, which is considerably harsher than Australia's. But the pair's loved ones back home seemed to have an idea. Almost immediately after the arrests, Prince's parents wrote a letter to the Vail Daily apologizing to the community for their son's behavior. They insisted that they raised Prince in a home with respectable values and that his actions were completely out of character. Family members begged for leniency in court after Caroll and Prince were convicted of robbery. Both young men apologized profusely to the victims, their families, and their country for the pain and embarrassment their actions caused. And while they weren't spared from prison time like they'd hoped, the judge still went easy on them. Caroll was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and Prince received a 4.5-year term, far less than the 25-year maximum they each faced. They were also ordered to pay more than $21,000 in restitution. Caroll avoided publicity after serving his time and returned to Australia, while Prince wrote a memoir about surviving life in a US prison. 17. Anthony Michael Corrado. A professional housekeeper in Collier County, Florida, realized that she wasn't dealing with a routine call for service when she arrived at a customer's home one afternoon in May 2023. She was greeted by a man covered in blood, and while most people would have hightailed it off the property right then and there, the housekeeper followed her client inside. She realized the urgent need to leave, though, after being led to a room containing the tarp-covered body of an elderly woman who'd clearly met a violent end. According to a probable cause statement, the man pulled back the tarp to reveal the victim's body. There was a bag over the victim's head, and when the housekeeper tried to remove the bag, the man told her to stop because she'd get blood everywhere. He asked his hired helper if she'd help him dispose of the body, and when she encouraged him to call 911, he said he couldn't because he'd go back to prison. The cleaning lady told the young man who'd hired her that she had to run out for some supplies, but instead she flagged down the first deputy she saw. Officers quickly arrived on scene and found the murdered victim, along with an elderly man who'd been beaten severely and was suffering from serious injuries. The man had returned home from grocery shopping after the housekeeper left, and according to authorities, responding deputies also found a bloody hammer at the house and observed blood on the walls and floors. The suspect was identified as 34-year-old Anthony Michael Corrado, and the victims were identified as his grandparents, Mary and Tony Schiavone. Records revealed that Mary had an order of protection against Corrado, who'd been released from prison the previous year. After being found alive, Tony Schiavone was airlifted to a trauma center. Neighbors who spoke with Wink News said that nothing unusual had ever been observed at the home prior to the gruesome murder and assault. They were shocked that something so horrific had happened so close to where they live. Cado refused to speak with authorities and was booked into custody on charges of second-degree murder and aggravated battery of a person over 65. But his motive for the alleged crime is unclear. 16. MacArthur Wheeler and Clifton Earl Johnson. On January 6, 1995, two men entered a bank in Swissvale, Pennsylvania. One of them got in line while the other robbed a teller at gunpoint. They then made off with around $6,000 and proceeded to rob another bank in the same fashion. Neither of the culprits wore masks or disguises during the robberies, nor did they try to shield their faces from the bank's security cameras. The suspect who stood in line, Clifton Earl Johnson, was arrested a few days after the crimes. His co-conspirator MacArthur Wheeler was captured a few months later after police released surveillance images and asked the public for help identifying him. When interrogators showed Wheeler pictures of himself at the crime scenes, he was shocked. He said, "But I wore the lemon juice. I wore the lemon juice." Detectives had absolutely no clue what he meant by this, but they soon learned that Wheeler and Johnson had rubbed lemon juice on their faces prior to the crimes, thinking it would make them invisible on camera. Their lack of disguises suddenly made a lot more sense to detectives, but at the same time, it was hard to understand how the men actually believed that lemon juice would make them absent from security footage. Wheeler said that Johnson gave him the idea. He said he was skeptical at first, but when he tried the method himself by slathering his face with lemon juice and taking a Polaroid, to his surprise, his face was absent from the photo. But of course, detectives came to the more rational conclusion that the camera had malfunctioned, or Wheeler had unknowingly snapped the photo at an angle that kept him out of the frame. Clifton Earl Johnson pleaded guilty to one of the robberies he committed with Wheeler and two others from unrelated cases. He testified against his accomplice and received a 5-year prison sentence as a result. MacArthur Wheeler was sentenced to 24.5 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. After reading about the case, Cornell University social psychology professor David Dunning began to wonder, in his own words, if Wheeler was too stupid to be a bank robber, perhaps he was also too stupid to know that he was too stupid to be a bank robber. That is, his stupidity protected him from an awareness of his own stupidity. Dunning and graduate student Justin Kruger worked together to study whether someone's perceived competence could make them ignorant of their actual abilities, or lack thereof. The researchers concluded that it's certainly possible and classified it as a cognitive bias that's now famously known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. They concluded that when a person is incompetent in their chosen strategies for achieving success and satisfaction, they come to inaccurate conclusions and make poor choices without realizing it. In other words, they're totally unaware of their own self-sabotage, and they think they're doing just fine. 15. Botched Alaska bank robberies. During the late afternoon hours one day in 2018, a man entered a bank in Anchorage, Alaska, and handed the teller a note stating, "This is a holdup. Please put the money they want in the bag. God help us." The teller then gave the thief $400 and he left. But the robber had written the demand note on the back of a subsidized housing application bearing his name and address. Needless to say, it didn't take police long to identify the suspect as Michael Gale Nash. They also didn't have to search very hard to track him down. Responding officers arrived at the scene a few minutes after the robbery to find Nash standing outside the bank, counting the stolen money. FBI spokeswoman Star Chief Vega Pelletier described it as being one of the quickest apprehensions in recent local history. According to a criminal complaint, Nash admitted to the robbery during questioning, and as a result he was federally charged for his alleged crimes. Nash's arrest came on the heels of another headline-making robbery at an Alaska bank. Just weeks earlier, in April 2018, 28-year-old Derek Moore and a male accomplice entered a Wells Fargo branch in Anchorage and held it up at gunpoint, and apparently they left with over $15,000 in cash. According to a federal complaint, the men ran across a parking lot, down a nature trail and into a cul-de-sac, where Moore's girlfriend, 31-year-old Bethany McKeel, was waiting for them in a getaway car. Little did they know, an informant was on the case and would soon turn over detrimental voice recordings to the FBI. In a tape-recorded conversation with McKeel and Moore, the couple allegedly bragged about how easy it was to carry out the robbery. And according to a transcript, Moore could be heard saying, "It's real easy, you just give the note to the teller. Once I put the bag in their face and told them to give me all of it, it was a wrap." Moore also allegedly raised the possibility of robbing another bank in the near future. But he didn't get the chance because the informant ratted him and McKeel out, and they were soon arrested for their alleged crimes. 14. Craig Abel. Criminal suspects have different ways of being uncooperative with law enforcement. 46-year-old Craig Abel's method involved acting as childish as possible in front of the camera in his booking cell at the West Penn Police Department in Wisconsin. Abel was accused of committing a hit and run after investigators concluded that some damage to a family's garage matched his truck. This was his 6th operating while intoxicated charge. And after spotting the camera in his cell, he began dancing, making strange facial expressions, lifting his shirt and slapping his midsection, and rolling around on the floor while verbally taunting the police. He also mooned the camera, slapped his behind, and farted. But that's not all, folks. He continued his childish display by slapping and hitting the walls, and performed what seemed like a middle-aged man's best attempt at twerking. The staff members watching on the other end eventually decided that they'd had enough of the strange strip-teasing tantrum. An officer entered the cell and ordered Abel to put his hands behind his back. But instead of complying, he questioned why he needed to be handcuffed when he was already locked in a room. The officer plainly replied, "You're pounding on the walls and exposing yourself." This apparently wasn't a good enough explanation for Abel though, who continued to refuse to follow orders. 2 more officers then entered the room and removed him, bringing his bizarre one-man variety show to an end. And in the end, Abel pleaded guilty to the operating while intoxicated charge and was sentenced to 4 years behind bars. 13. Lance Kurtz. If there's someone on this planet who should have exercised their right to remain silent, it's 21-year-old Lance Kurtz. He first caught law enforcement's attention one night in early 2023 when someone reported seeing his car on fire along a roadside in Flagler County, Florida. By the time a deputy stopped by to check out the stranded motorist, the fire was out, but he quickly noticed that Kurtz had no tags on his vehicle. Kurtz said that he'd just bought the car and planned to take care of the tags later that week. Then, without being asked, he confessed to having an unregistered gun in the car. The deputy let him off with a verbal warning, but wouldn't allow him to drive his vehicle. When asked what his plan was, Kurtz said he'd call a friend to pick him up. The friend was coming from at least an hour away, so he had a long wait ahead of him. But he wanted to feed his dog, who was in the car. So after directing him to a nearby gas station and telling him to hurry because it was about to close, the deputy left the scene. A few hours later, law enforcement received a call about a break-in at the very same convenience store. By then, the intruder was gone, but they left behind a key piece of identifying information on the counter, their debit card, and it belonged to none other than Lance Kurtz. The deputy who'd spoken with the young man earlier in the evening returned to the roadside where his car was parked. Lance was there, and he quickly admitted to breaking into the business by maneuvering the door open with a knife. He said that the store was closing when he arrived and the clerk refused to serve him, but that he needed dog food. The eccentric suspect claimed that he left his debit card behind on purpose so he could return during business hours and pay for the items he stole. He also offered to show police the knife he used to break into the store. It would have been a good idea for Lance to stop talking at that point, but he continued to overshare. Once again, without being asked, he admitted to having some LSD tablets in his possession. But the cops looked everywhere and couldn't find the drugs. At the same time, Lance's behavior was becoming increasingly strange. After putting 2 and 2 together, the deputies and the suspect realized that he'd swallowed his entire stash. Lance was booked into custody on suspicion of armed burglary of a dwelling/structure and petty theft. While his current legal situation's unclear, it appears as though he was released from custody after posting a $10,000 bond and landing back behind bars for a few weeks. A well-meaning friend created a crowdfunding campaign in an effort to raise money for a better defense lawyer for Lance. On the website, they wrote that the young man's behavior had changed noticeably leading up to his arrest, and that Lance was experiencing an especially rough period amid lifelong emotional distress. The campaign is still active, but has only raised $355 of its $10,000 goal, suggesting that not everyone shares these sympathetic views of the person who created the page. 12. Alicia Tiani. A neighborhood dispute in Albuquerque, New Mexico devolved into an immature act of vandalism one night in 2021 when one of the parties spray-painted the other's house. The victim heard movement outside and thought someone was at her door, but when her son looked through the peephole, all he could see was red. She exited the house to find the word "white trash" scrawled across her garage in red paint, along with a statement below it that was too sloppily written to be understood. There was also paint on the front door and two of the family's vehicles. Witnesses quickly directed police to the home of a neighbor named Alicia Tiani. While the victims said they didn't know the woman, others told police that Tiani had recently been trying to collect dues from households for a homeowners association that didn't exist. They speculated that the suspect's alleged act of vandalism might have had something to do with her anger over people refusing to pay the non-existent HOA dues. Neighbors also said that Tiani had complained in the past about the amount of items in front of the victim's house. Local station KRGE reported that Tiani was actually listed as the director and treasurer of an active HOA, but that no updates had been reported in over a year, suggesting that it was more or less defunct. Either way, vandalizing someone's house is no way to resolve a complaint about someone's residence already being an eyesore. According to police, the victim said she'd seen Tiani walking by with a can of spray paint and her hand covered in red shortly after discovering the graffiti on her house. She told officers that Tiani asked her what had happened as if she had nothing to do with the crime. When police confronted Tiani at her home, she still had paint all over her hand. She almost immediately said that she was drunk and tried telling her side of the story, which didn't make a whole lot of sense. In body cam footage of the arrest, she could also be heard admitting to the act of vandalism multiple times. Tiani was charged with 2 felony counts of criminal damage to property totaling more than $1,000. But thanks to her clean record and her displays of remorse, the prosecutor saw her as a good candidate for a pre-diversion program, which enabled her to avoid a conviction as long as she followed certain rules set forth by the court. In Tiani's case, this involved regular drug tests and check-ins with her case officer. She was also ordered to pay $4,400 for the damages to the victim's home. While the middle-aged vandal managed to avoid any serious legal consequences, the court of public opinion was arguably less forgiving. In 2023, body cam footage of Tiani's arrest was featured on the new ID channel crime series called Late Night Lockup. Cringe-worthy clips from the booking and processing unit showed her being uncooperative and overtly flirtatious with officers, who made it clear that they didn't want her to call them baby. Fellow arrestees were also noticeably irritated by her behavior as she rambled non-stop, as if she were at a social club rather than jail, and completely lacked an understanding of how serious the situation was. 11. Orlando Henderson. To many, it seems like common sense not to post photos of oneself with large amounts of money or extravagant purchases after committing a robbery. But a lot of criminals seem to miss this page in their handbook. A 29-year-old Wells Fargo employee from Charlotte, North Carolina named Orlando Henderson fell into the latter category in 2019 when he flaunted stacks of cash and an extravagant lifestyle that he was accused of funding with money stolen from his workplace. According to federal authorities, Henderson stole cash from deposits made by customers on at least 18 separate occasions and falsified records to conceal the thefts. He allegedly took upwards of $88,000 total. The release announcing his arrest stated that on the same days he was suspected of stealing money from the bank's vault, Henderson made cash deposits at an ATM near his employer. He was also accused of destroying documents and making false entries or having his co-workers make false entries in the bank's books. Henderson allegedly used some of the stolen cash as a down payment on a Mercedes-Benz and obtained a loan for the balance using fake documents. He was charged with transactional laundering, 2 counts of financial institution fraud, 19 counts of theft, embezzlement and misapplication, as well as 12 counts of making false entries. Most of these charges can come with hefty prison sentences and fines. And in Henderson's case, he was looking at the possibility of up to 30 years and a $1 million penalty each for several counts that he faced. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of financial institution fraud and 1 count of transactional laundering, and was sentenced to 1 year in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. The court also ordered Henderson to pay back all the money he stole. 10. Douglas Peter Kelly. Cops love it when someone makes their job easier, and they love it even more when a dim-witted criminal unwittingly hands themselves into custody. In June of 2018, a Florida man named Douglas Peter Kelly allegedly called the Putnam County Sheriff's Office and shared his suspicions that he'd been dealt a bad batch of methamphetamine. He said he had a violent reaction to the drug, which meth is known to do, but apparently it was unusual for the drug to have that effect on Kelly. According to authorities, the concerned user said he wanted to press charges against his dealer and have the product looked at to determine whether he was sold the wrong narcotic. Detectives said they'd be happy to help and told Kelly to come on by the station. It's unclear whether they thought he was serious or not until he actually showed up at the station and handed over a bag of crystalline powder. It tested positive for methamphetamine, and Kelly was charged with possession as a result. In a viral Facebook post detailing the arrest, the Sheriff's Department wrote, "Remember, our detectives are always ready to assist anyone who believes they were misled in their illegal drug purchase." Do you know anyone who's been arrested for doing something stupid? Tell us their story in the comments below. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel. 9. Anthony Godard. Bail bond agent Nimia Cropper exited the Mecklenburg County Jail in North Carolina one day in January 2023 and discovered that her SUV had vanished from the parking lot. Surveillance footage revealed that just minutes earlier, an accused car thief named Anthony Deshawn Godard had bonded out with help from a different agent. He was allegedly seen stealing Cropper's vehicle and driving away in the jail security video. Given the nature of her profession, Cropper had seen a lot of crazy things over the years, but this was her first experience with the level of audacity that the suspect displayed. Speaking with WSOC-TV, she described Godard as the city's boldest and dumbest criminal. At the same time, it wasn't Godard's first rodeo with the law over stolen vehicle allegations. Based on his record, car theft seems to be his crime of choice. It was repeat offenders like him that made Cropper wish that authorities would crack down harder on crime. Godard's alleged actions made her feel especially concerned for people who lacked comprehensive insurance coverage for their cars. In other words, their policy wouldn't cover their total losses if their vehicle were to be stolen or destroyed. The infuriated bond agent told WSOC that she'd already used her connections within the bail bond community to ensure that Godard was blacklisted, and that he'd have an extremely hard time finding someone willing to bond him out the next time he landed behind bars. In fact, she said she couldn't wait for it to happen. Unfortunately, though, when the story broke, Godard was still at large and Cropper's SUV was still missing. According to jail records, it appears as though the suspected car thief hasn't been captured yet. 8. Sha Brown. A Boost mobile employee in Philadelphia didn't have much to offer to a thief who entered the store one evening in 2019 and demanded cash at gunpoint. The worker explained that the store didn't keep much money on hand, but he told the robber that he could retrieve more cash from a co-worker who was outside the store. This wasn't true, but the suspect, later identified as 20-year-old Sha Brown, bought the explanation and allowed the employee to leave. But on his way out, the worker locked the thief inside the business. After realizing that he'd been outsmarted, Brown began shooting at the doors and windows in an attempt to break out of the store. When this didn't work though, he allegedly ran into the basement and began banging on the door of an adjacent business. Diana Sullivan, who worked next door, later told NBC Philadelphia that Brown was unable to get into the store because it has really strong locks. She said he even tried shooting the lock out, but it didn't budge. A brief standoff ensued, while Brown remained barricaded inside the store. And just 45 minutes later, he was taken into custody. Brown was also identified as the suspect in the robbery of another cell phone store, less than an hour before he robbed Boost Mobile. According to police, he entered a Metro PCS store with his face half covered and robbed the register at gunpoint. He also stole an iPhone 7, even though newer and more expensive models were on display. Store employee Diodara Colon held back very little while telling ABC about the disorganized nature of the crime. She described the suspect as calm and dumb, and said that she and her co-workers didn't really know what he was doing. Colon also said that Brown made small talk and flirted while carrying out the sloppy robbery. Like most cell phone stores, the business didn't have a large amount of cash on hand, so he didn't make off with very much. Brown was charged with 18 counts between the two alleged thefts, including robbery, recklessly endangering another person, theft by receiving stolen property, aggravated assault, terroristic threats, and more. 7. Nicholas F. Branan. Some might say that luck was on Nicholas F. Branan's side when he managed to avoid jail time after deliberately crashing his car into a City Hall building in Cumberland, Wisconsin in 2021. Security footage showed the sedan smashing through the glass doors during the evening hours. And a few moments later, Branan exited the vehicle and sat down next to it. He seemed oddly calm for someone who just rammed a car through the entrance of a building. The local police station is located inside City Hall, so it wasn't long before an officer arrived at the scene. By then, Branan had his hands in the air as if to show that he was willing to cooperate and be taken into custody peacefully. But the officer had some questions first, including why the disgruntled driver committed the destructive act in the first place. Branan said that his son had recently been arrested on a drug charge that he believed was more serious than the incident warranted. He felt as though the Cumberland police were conspiring against his son and said the situation had been stressing him out. In addition to confessing that he was drunk, Branan admitted that he crashed into the building on purpose. He said he wanted to send a message to the people he thought were being unfair toward his son. And when subjected to a BAC test, his blood alcohol content was more than twice the legal limit for driving. All things considered, it's pretty surprising that he didn't get locked up for the crime. But he did get stuck with a nearly $32,000 debt for the damages he caused to City Hall, and a requirement to pay it in monthly installments of at least $100. Branan was also ordered to serve either 10 days in jail or perform 80 hours of community service, and he was banned from City Hall without a police escort. 6. Claude Vincent Griffin. In what appears to be an impromptu burglary at a cell phone store in Florida during the early morning hours in June 2023, the suspect in question robbed the business wearing a cardboard box over his head as a disguise. A security camera captured footage of the man entering the store in Miami Gardens at around 4 a.m. and smashing a display case as he ransacked the inventory. He made off with 19 iPhones and more than $8,000 in cash, according to store owner Jeremiah Baganza, who told NBC6 that he noticed the suspect briefly lifting the box he was wearing on his head to get a better look at something he was stealing. Baganza managed to pause the video at just the right moment and caught a still shot of the man's face. The store owner then set to work warning nearby businesses about the thief and looking for the suspect himself. Police eventually found the alleged burglar drinking booze at a nearby liquor store. 33-year-old Claude Vincent Griffin was charged with grand theft, burglary, criminal mischief, cocaine possession, and resisting an officer without violence. In the meantime, social media users had a field day commenting on his unusual disguise. 5. Kazi. Better known as the Duct Tape Bandit, a Kentucky man named Kazi attempted to rob a liquor store in 2007 with his face wrapped in duct tape and a t-shirt pulled up over his head. He claimed he had a gun and threatened to kill the clerk, hoping the employee would fork over the cash he was demanding. But things didn't go as planned. The store's manager chased the suspect outside with a club, and employees held him down until police arrived. Kazi's makeshift disguise quickly earned him a top-ranking spot among the dumbest criminals in history as the story went viral. He made the situation even worse for himself when he threw up gang signs and proclaimed his innocence during a jailhouse interview. The wannabe bandit ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree robbery and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was paroled in 2014, but soon landed himself back behind bars for assaulting a businessman named Marcus Woodward. According to authorities, Kazi and an accomplice approached the victim in an alleyway, shoved him to the ground, and stole his jewelry and some other items. Kazi was convicted of first-degree robbery and sentenced to 12 years in prison, which he's currently serving. When he finishes serving his current term, he'll have to serve another 2.5 years to finish out his duct tape robbery sentence since he violated his parole. 4. James Blankenship. 32-year-old James Blankenship's mother banned him from her home when they had some issues getting along in 2013. But 3 months later, he decided to break into his mum's house in Ohio in broad daylight. He removed a screen and crawled in through a window, but his mother quickly discovered his presence and he fled the scene on foot. Blankenship's mum called the police, and a neighbor told responding officers which direction they'd seen the suspect running in. The cops found Blankenship hiding in a crawl space near his mother's home. He was surprised to learn that he was being arrested for burglary because he thought a person could only get arrested for burglary at nighttime. It's unclear where he got this idea, but the police were quick to correct Blankenship's misconception and let him know that breaking into someone's home is illegal at all times. The unsavvy criminal pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of breaking and entering and was sentenced to 6 months in jail with 120 days suspended, which meant that he'd be locked up for 3 months. And as an additional punishment, he was fined $100. 3. Umar Murza. When he failed to land a job at a gambling parlor in Birmingham, England in 2017, 26-year-old Umar Murza entered the business one morning and demanded money at gunpoint. He was wearing a mask throughout the robbery, but removed it as he exited the store with over $21,000 in cash that he'd just stolen. Employees caught a close enough glimpse of the suspect to recognize him as a recent job applicant, and it just so happened that the parlor still had Murza's resume on file. During a visit to his home, police reportedly found a note written on a betting slip stating, "I've got a gun, open the door or I will shoot you." It appeared to be the same note that had been used in the robbery. Officers also discovered a fake gun and the bag that the robbery suspect was seen using during the crime. According to law enforcement, Murza had also been present during the recent robbery of another gambling parlor, where a fellow suspect was accused of using the same fake gun to hold the place up. A quick-thinking manager activated an alarm, causing the place to fill with smoke, and luckily the police caught the suspects after they left empty-handed. The young man's lawyer told the court that his client had a severe gambling addiction which drove him to commit the robberies. Murza had been hooked on internet betting for at least 3 years when he found himself in a desperate position. As a forklift driver by day, he couldn't afford to pay off his mounting gambling debts, which totaled more than $30,000. But after pleading guilty to robbery and being sentenced to 6 years in prison, Murza would have to worry about his financial problems at a later date and time. 2. David and Ezra Guera. Investigators with the Bexar County Sheriff's Office in Texas didn't wait long to act after receiving a tip in 2022 about a 17-year-old named David Guera. He'd apparently posted photos of himself with THC cartridges, weapons, and cash on social media. And in the pictures, he could be seen wearing what looked like expensive bling. An investigation was launched, and when they got the chance, deputies pulled Guera's vehicle over. Inside the car, they found hash oil, a loaded handgun, and cash. During a subsequent search of Guera's home, authorities reportedly found 3 guns, cocaine, more hash oil, marijuana, and $15,000 in cash. David Guera was charged with possession of a controlled substance, reckless conduct, traffic, and unlawfully carrying a weapon. A second suspect, 21-year-old Ezra Guera, was charged with possession of a controlled substance with intent to deliver and possession of marijuana. Unfortunately though, the current status of the case is unclear. 1. Cory T Phillips. At around 10 p.m. on a Monday night in 2019, a man wearing a knit cap and a t-shirt over his face entered a hotel in Paducah, Kentucky and demanded money at gunpoint. When the clerk handed over the cash, the robber set his gun on the front desk because he needed 2 hands to put the money in his bag. The employee grabbed the gun and pointed it at the suspect, who then fled the scene. Investigators discovered that the gun had recently been reported stolen in a home burglary. A few days later, police pulled over a grey sedan for a routine traffic stop and noticed that the driver, 26-year-old Cory T Phillips, was acting nervous. Inside the car, they found a laptop that had been reported stolen in the same burglary that the gun was taken. After putting 2 and 2 together with the computer and the firearm, detectives found other evidence connecting Phillips to the robbery. Phillips was charged with first-degree robbery and receiving a stolen firearm. And according to records, he's currently serving prison time for both counts, along with multiple other charges. He's expected to be released in 2033. Joshua Michael Rosebush. While approaching a pickup truck during a routine traffic stop in Saginaw County, Michigan in 2019, Officer Jeff Koenig was shot in the face and shoulder. At the time, Koenig was pulling over the driver for having his headlights off at 2 a.m. But he didn't realize that the truck was stolen or that it was being driven by a parolee who was at large for skipping out on his parole. Koenig's plan was to tell the driver to turn his lights on and continue with his shift. He had no reason to suspect that the man behind the wheel of the pickup truck was going to turn violent. But before Koenig could engage in any meaningful conversation, the driver pointed a stolen .380 caliber pistol at him, said "nighty-night," and then pulled the trigger. The suspect, 29-year-old Joshua Michael Rosebush, fled the scene. Luckily though, he was taken into custody after a shootout with police. Officer Koenig survived after taking 2 bullets at point-blank range, and thankfully no other cops were injured. Rosebush, who was on parole at the time of his arrest, already had a long list of felony convictions under his belt. He took a bullet to the jaw during the shootout, but he survived and was charged with a variety of crimes. 19 days earlier, Rosebush had cut off 2 ankle bracelets, one that monitored his location and another that detected alcohol consumption. A jury found Rosebush guilty of 26 counts, including assault with intent to murder, assault with intent to do great bodily harm, 13 felony firearm counts, 5 counts of being a felon in possession of a firearm, and 3 counts of unlawfully driving away a motor vehicle. He also received 1 count each of assaulting, resisting, or obstructing police, receiving and concealing of a stolen firearm, and carrying a dangerous weapon with unlawful intent. And as a result, Rosebush was sentenced to at least 75 years in prison, with an earliest possible release date of November 2096. 9. Keith Lloyd. In 2016, a 41-year-old Florida man named Keith Lloyd fatally shot his pregnant ex-girlfriend, 24-year-old Say Dixon, at her parents' home in Pine Hills, Florida. Dixon had recently moved in with her family after getting into a fight with Lloyd that turned violent. Lloyd remained at large for nearly a month before being spotted at a Walmart store in Orlando in early 2017. When Police Master Sergeant Deborah Clayton tried to apprehend him, he shot her and fled the scene. And sadly, Clayton died from her injuries at a nearby hospital. The pursuit continued as Lloyd shot at another officer's vehicle and carjacked a civilian. And while searching for Lloyd on a motorcycle, Deputy Norman Lewis was fatally struck by a van. Lloyd managed to stay far enough ahead of law enforcement to once again slip through their grasp, sparking a 9-day manhunt. A $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to his capture, while SWAT teams and police units searched through neighborhoods, houses, and apartment buildings. In addition to searching for Lloyd, authorities arrested his former boss, his niece, and an ex-girlfriend for allegedly helping the double murderer run from the law. After searching more than 100 houses and expanding the manhunt into neighboring Polk County, law enforcement finally captured Lloyd at a house in Carver Shores. As officers surrounded the house, Lloyd finally decided to surrender. he allegedly threw 2 guns onto the ground and began belly crawling toward the police. By then, officers had received tips claiming that Lloyd had said he'd rather die than go back to prison. So, it was no surprise when things got violent while police attempted to take him into custody, with several officers delivering multiple muzzle strikes, kicks and punches to Lloyd. He lost his left eye as a result of his injuries, and some felt that the police used excessive force. However, State Attorney Phil Archer ruled that the use of force was justified. Lloyd was convicted of 3 murders and was sentenced to death, but he's since appealed his case and is trying to get a new trial. 8. Matthew Ryle. It was around 3 a.m. on New Year's Eve in 2017 when 911 dispatchers in Douglas County, Colorado received their first call from 37-year-old Matthew Rial. A disagreement between Rial and his roommate had allegedly gotten violent, and Rial was accusing his roommate of attacking him. But after noticing that the address was flagged as the residence of a man with PTSD who might have access to weapons, deputies took a cautious approach. When they arrived though, it seemed like things had calmed down. Rial's roommate Matthew Thompson told a responding deputy that Rial didn't have any mental disabilities or drug habits that he knew of, and he didn't know why Rial was so upset. Thompson was cooperative, but Rial got into an argument with the deputy because he was refusing to hand over his ID. During the disagreement, Rial began to loudly yell that he was being assaulted, even though body cam footage showed that the officers weren't hurting him in the slightest. In fact, their main goal was to de-escalate the situation. Deputy Zachary Parrish managed to calm Rial down, and after determining that no crimes had been committed, law enforcement left the scene. But then, 2 hours later, just after 5 a.m., Rial dialed 911 again. His tone this time was noticeably irate compared to earlier, and he wasn't making much sense. So Deputy Parrish and his fellow officers returned to the residence, where Rial initially opened the door but suddenly slammed it in their faces. He then began yelling through the door, and it was clear based on his behavior that he was in a mentally unstable state. Law enforcement decided that it would be appropriate to take Rial into custody on a mental health hold, which meant that he'd be evaluated at a psychiatric emergency room. But as they made a coordinated entry into the apartment, they quickly discovered that Rial had trashed the place in a suspected attempt to make the officers' entry difficult. He was later found barricaded in a bedroom, and he refused to come out. Left with no other option, Parrish and his fellow deputy Taylor Davis kicked in the door. But on the other side, Rial was waiting with a loaded AR-15. He immediately began shooting at the deputies, firing an estimated 30 rounds in just a handful of seconds. Parrish was then struck by the gunfire, which forced him to collapse on the ground. As 2 members of the team began pulling Parrish across the floor in an attempt to get him out of the apartment, Rial began shooting again. Deputies Jeff Pell and Michael Doyle were struck, and as the bullets continued to fly, they were forced to retreat from the scene. Meanwhile, Deputy Taylor Davis took cover in the roommate's bedroom, and knowing she was unlikely to survive if she stayed in the apartment, she jumped out of the window. She was hit by a bullet during her escape, but managed to reach the growing number of law enforcement officers from various agencies who were gathering around the building. At this point, Parrish was still in the apartment. Knowing the time was of the essence, a SWAT team attempted to make entry, but every time they approached, Rial sprayed bullets in their directions. Then, after shooting at the police for an hour and a half, Rial was killed by returned gunfire. Unfortunately, by then it was too late to save Parrish, but the other officers who were shot survived their injuries. Investigators found 11 guns in Rial's room, which explains how he was able to shoot nearly 400 rounds at law enforcement. His motive for committing the senseless act of violence is unclear, but he had a long history of mental illness. The tragedy prompted lawmakers to propose a new law that would make it easier to temporarily revoke guns from mentally unstable individuals. But in a heavily pro-gun state, gaining support for the policy proved difficult, and the bill failed to pass in the state legislature. 7. William Paul Jones. 22-year-old Christopher Neal had just moved into his new home in Comstock Township, Michigan with his wife and young child when he came face to face with an armed intruder in 2019. Neil dialed 911 while his wife and daughter hid upstairs, and during the call, the dispatcher could hear the suspect William Paul Jones reassuring Neil that he wasn't going to hurt him. The dispatcher immediately began trying to reason with Jones, asking if he'd at least let the family leave the house. But he refused, and it quickly turned into a hostage situation, prompting a multi-agency response. Kalamazoo deputies and a Michigan state trooper entered the home to find that Jones had barricaded himself and Neil inside a first-floor bedroom. Law enforcement tried desperately to reason with Jones, who shouted back and forth with them through the door. At that point, the number one goal was to convince Jones to release Neil, who yelled through the door to confirm that he was still alive. But Jones's behavior became increasingly erratic and agitated, and at one point Neil could be heard yelling that the suspect was on top of him. When gunfire broke out, it was clear that the situation wasn't going to end peacefully. 3 officers were struck by bullets before the shooting stopped. And by the time police entered the bedroom, Jones had escaped through a window, and Neil was dead from a gunshot wound to the back of the head. Law enforcement took it heavy when they realized that they'd failed to rescue the hostage they were so intent on saving. Their main focus turned toward capturing Jones before any more lives were lost, and luckily he was captured shortly after fleeing from the home. Jones was convicted of 18 felonies including first-degree murder, assault with intent to murder, breaking and entering resulting in murder, and more. The murder conviction alone carries a mandatory life sentence, which thankfully means that Jones will never step foot in the free world again. 6. Yvette Lares Garcia. During a routine traffic stop in Clackamas County, Oregon in November 2021, Gladstone officer Clement Lamb discovered that 37-year-old Yvette Lares Garcia was wanted on a theft warrant out of Texas. The state of Texas was willing to extradite Garcia, which meant that it was mandatory to arrest her. Garcia was cooperative and polite throughout the arrest, but she repeatedly mentioned how her dogs were at home and she had nobody to care for them. So, with no other option but to have the dogs taken to a shelter while Garcia dealt with her legal issues, the police took her to her apartment so she could help put them in leashes. They were able to leash one of the dogs right away, but the other one ran upstairs. Garcia and Sergeant Travis Hill went after the dog, while Lau stayed downstairs with the already leashed pooch. The suspect was handcuffed behind her back, but she managed to grab a gun from somewhere in the room while Hill tried coaxing the dog over to him. And as they made their way downstairs, Garcia shot Hill in the arm and leg. With Sergeant Hill collapsed on the floor, Lau sprang into action and returned fire at Garcia. He struck her in the torso and ordered her to drop her weapon, but she blatantly refused several times, saying that she wasn't going back to jail. Even after being struck multiple times in the torso, Garcia still refused to drop the gun and continued to shoot. Luckily though, she was finally taken into custody with the help from backup officers. The effects of Garcia's actions were permanent to Sergeant Hill, who suffered permanent injuries that forced him into retirement. As it turned out, Garcia was accused of embezzling over $1 million in Texas and was facing potential prison time. But her attempts to avoid facing the warrant only landed her even more time behind bars. She received a 10-year sentence for attempted aggravated murder, the maximum allowable under state law, and will be extradited to Texas to be tried on the embezzlement case after serving her time in Oregon. 5. James Ramirez. After being robbed at gunpoint in broad daylight one morning in 2021, a teenager met with a police officer in an Albuquerque parking lot to report the crime. The thieves made off with the young man's PlayStation 4, his wallet, and a gold chain. And during his conversation with Officer Mario Verbeck, the victim spotted the suspects across the street. Verbeck and another officer, James Eichel, chased after the suspects on foot. But during the pursuit, a young man later identified as 28-year-old James Ramirez shot at the officers. Both Verbeck and Eichel were hit, and after realizing that Verbeck wasn't capable of getting up and was in desperate need of emergency care, Eichel went to get help. After seeing the shooting from his home, a nearby resident named Johnny Garcia waited for the gunfire to stop. Then, he went outside and helped Officer Verbeck walk out to the street, where they were met with paramedics. Meanwhile, the gunman ran into a nearby parking lot where he exchanged gunfire with Officer Harry Gunderson and Lieutenant Sean Kenny, and unfortunately both officers were struck by bullets. Ramirez refused orders to put the gun down and continued shooting, even after being shot by the police. He finally stopped though when he couldn't stand the pain of his injuries and was taken into custody once backup arrived. All 4 officers who were shot survived, and Ramirez went on to recover from his gunshot wounds to the chest, thigh, leg, and arm. He was charged with both federal and state crimes, but then he suddenly died in custody while awaiting trial, and the cause of his death remains undetermined. After spending his 30th wedding anniversary in the hospital, Officer Verbeck and his wife made up for it by renewing their vows. It only felt right to ask the man who saved his life, Johnny Garcia, to be his best man, and Garcia was honored to accept the offer. 4. John Terry Chapman Jr. While conducting routine patrol one day in July of 2018, police officers in Tulsa, Oklahoma had a brief conversation with a man and a woman who were sitting in a minivan in a parking lot. A man in the driver's seat, later identified as 34-year-old John Terry Chapman Jr., politely declined to provide his name or ID when asked. And at that point, there was no reason to suspect the couple of any crimes, so they had every right not to engage with the officers if they didn't want to. But after going back to his car, one of the cops ran the minivan's license plate and discovered that it belonged to a different vehicle. Officers then caught up with the couple at a nearby Quick Trip gas station. The woman willingly handed over her ID, but Chapman refused. He accused the officers of lacking the proper jurisdiction to arrest him and demanded that they call their superiors, which they said they'd do if he'd cooperate. But he refused to exit the van at the officer's command, prompting Sergeant Mike Parsons to threaten to fire a pepper ball into the vehicle. And when it became clear that Chapman had no plans to comply with law enforcement, Parsons fired the pepper ball gun. Pepper ball is like a powder form of pepper spray. Like mace, it serves as a non-lethal means of disabling a suspect. But when the pepper ball was deployed inside the minivan, Chapman fired a gun at the cops, striking Parsons in the leg. Parsons was in a lot of pain, but he was strangely capable of continuing to work the scene. He wasn't experiencing the type of blood loss that normally occurs from a gunshot wound to the thigh, and he didn't appear to be going into shock. Knowing that Chapman was dangerous and needed to be apprehended as soon as possible, Parsons pushed past the pain and focused on the task at hand. An officer had returned fire when Chapman shot Parsons, but the suspect was still moving around in the minivan, making it unclear whether he'd been hit, and it looked as though he might be reaching for another gun. After carefully calculating their next move, the officers swiftly removed Chapman from the van and took him into custody. Chapman was shot during the altercation, but he survived. As paramedics cut Parsons' pants off to assess his bullet wound in the back of an ambulance, a coin fell out of his pocket. It was a US Navy challenge coin that his friend and fellow officer Con Erickson had given to him as a symbol of their close friendship. And it very well may have saved Parsons' life. If the coin hadn't absorbed most of the bullet's impact, the likelihood of striking a major artery or sustaining a far more damaging injury would have been much higher. Chapman was tried in both state and federal court for his crimes. And in 2019, he was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. The conviction was overturned based on a discrepancy regarding Chapman's intent, but he remains behind bars in Oklahoma, where he's currently serving a 105-year sentence. 3. Joel Young. In February 2010, 911 dispatchers in Whatcom County, Washington were flooded with calls about gunshots being fired in a normally quiet subdivision. According to callers, a drunk man was threatening his neighbor with a shotgun and firing warning shots into the air. Responding deputies spoke with the target of the threats, who said that he was having a fire in his backyard when the smoke upset his neighbor, 60-year-old Joel Young. The man said he didn't take Young's threats very seriously, but he also put the fire out to avoid escalating the situation. When the deputies asked Young to come outside without his gun and talk to them, he basically told them to get lost. A third household also said that they'd been threatened by Young on more than one occasion, including that same day. At some point, Young came outside, saw deputies crouching near his garage, and then went back into his home. However, he came back out a little while later with a gun and fired at one deputy, striking him in the head. Another deputy returned fire, but sadly he was also shot in the head. Amazingly, Ryan Rathbun and Jason Thompson both survived and even continued to work the scene while they waited for backup and emergency medical responders. But they were injured and losing blood fast, and they needed treatment as soon as possible. A civilian rushed over with his own handgun and emptied the entire clip in the direction of Young's house. Several armed neighbors also came to the scene and stayed there until backup arrived, ready to fire if the need arose. They also rendered first aid to Rathbun and Thompson, whose conditions were worsening as the minutes passed. Young eventually surrendered and was booked on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 6 counts of reckless endangerment, and first-degree assault while armed with a firearm. He already received charges of second-degree assault while armed with a firearm and felony harassment. He pleaded not guilty and remains behind bars on $5 million bail while he awaits trial. Deputy Rathbun lost almost all vision in his left eye and has undergone more than a half-dozen surgeries. Deputy Thompson sustained a brain injury and now struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder. And both men were out of work for about a year before returning to the force full-time. 2. Tyron Lamb. After seeing a car blow through a red light one evening in 2021, a police officer in Greenfield, Wisconsin tried to perform a traffic stop. The driver, 31-year-old Tyron Lamb, refused to pull over. A high-speed chase ensued, and spike strips failed to disable the vehicle. The pursuit came to an end, though, when the car collided with a pickup truck at an intersection. Officers couldn't see into the car very well because the airbags had been deployed. But as they repeatedly ordered Lamb to show his hands, he instead grabbed a gun and fired multiple shots through the windshield. Lamb continued shooting as he climbed out of the car, striking Officer Adam Franco in the hand, chest and thigh before fleeing the scene on foot. Harrowing body cam footage showed Officer Franco begging a fellow officer not to let him die as she rendered first aid. He was then rushed to the hospital in critical condition and thankfully survived. Police caught up with Lamb near the scene of the crash. He continued firing at officers, leaving them with no choice but to shoot back. And as a consequence for his actions, Lamb was killed in the exchange of gunfire. At the time of his death, the suspect was on probation after serving prison time for 2 separate convictions of attempting to flee or elude law enforcement. He also had a prior conviction for armed robbery. After being released from his most recent prison stint in 2020, Lamb took a job renovating homes. He was a father of 2 with a 3rd child on the way. It's unclear why he didn't cooperate with the traffic stop, but his decision to shoot at the cops cost him his life, which was worse than any other consequence he would have suffered, even if he was breaking the law when he got pulled over. 1. John Winston Borgman. During the pre-dawn hours one day in 2023, 911 dispatchers in Yakima County, Washington received a hang-up call from someone who could be heard arguing with their spouse before the line disconnected. After tracing the call, a dispatcher reached out and spoke with someone at the house, who said that a man named John Winston Borgman was there and that he was assaulting his wife. Deputies responded to the scene at 1 a.m. and spoke with Borgman's wife outside the house. She and another witness said that Borgman had mental health and drug issues, and the wife requested a police escort into the home so she could grab some belongings and leave with her children. Deputies Andrew Wilkinson and Travis Watkins accompanied the woman to the entrance of the home, but when she opened the door, Borgman was allegedly standing there with a military-style semi-automatic rifle. And, according to court documents, a deputy ordered Borgman to drop the weapon, but he fired at the cops instead. As Deputy Wilkinson went to his vehicle to retrieve his own rifle, the suspect fired 6 more rounds, striking Deputy Watkins in the forearm, hand, and abdomen. Wilkinson put his injured colleague into his patrol car and rushed him to a nearby fire station, where he received first aid before being taken to the hospital. In the meantime, Borgman went outside and interacted with other responding deputies using the radio in Watkins' vehicle, and surprisingly, he cooperated with their orders to surrender. Borgman faces 1 count of second-degree assault related to domestic violence and 2 counts of first-degree assault. Police also seized more than 20 guns from his house. The suspect had previously lost his right to own a gun due to a conviction for second-degree robbery in 2009, but his right to own a firearm was restored in 2017. During his preliminary hearing, Borgman reportedly tried to waive his right to an attorney, claiming that he could do a better job defending himself. He was muted several times throughout the proceeding, which took place on Zoom, and eventually he agreed to accept a public defender. The case is ongoing though, so Borgman has yet to receive his sentencing. If you witnessed a shooting taking place between police officers and a suspected criminal, and you had a gun on you at the time, would you attempt to help the officers? Or would you run away from the situation and let the professionals handle it? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.